One. My guest today is Jennifer Pruitt, who is the author of Building a Caliphate, Construction, Destruction, a Sectarian Identity of the Early Fatimid Caliphate. And when we were talking earlier, you said that the Fatimids are your favorite Islamic caliphate. So what made them your favorite?
So it's so complicated. So what I love about the Fatimids is that they reign in a time in which there are three caliphates.
Mm,
So when the Prophet Muhammad died, we have a series of successors. And this is where the word caliph comes from, right? So caliph, it means to succeed. So it means that anyone who is a caliph is a successor to the Prophet Muhammad. At the time that the Fatimids reigned, though, we have three of them. Now, you
mm.
can't have three successors to the Prophet Muhammad, right? There should only
Yeah.
be one caliph at any
He
one
did have
time.
a kind of a huge family though, to be fair.
Yeah, so that's an interesting point. So what we have during the Fatimid period, especially the early Fatimid period, is we have three different powers saying, "Hey, we're the caliphs, we're the rightful successors."
Mm,
One is in Baghdad, one is in Cordoba in Spain, and one is in Egypt, in Cairo.
yeah.
And so each of them say, "We're the rightful successors." The Fatimids are the only ones that are actually related to the Prophet Muhammad. So they are Shi'i in orientation, right? They
Mm,
are Shiites, and so they believe that a caliph needs to be from the Prophet's family.
yeah.
So they believe this, and then they found Cairo as a capital city for the first time. And so this is one of the reasons that they're my favorites, is that I love Cairo. I've spent a lot of
Mm.
time in Cairo. So this was the time that Cairo was a kind of capital city of the caliphate. The other reason I love the Fatimids is that they have a really kind of unique religious identity, that we can talk about
The
as we go.
Shia sect was quite new at the time too, weren't it?
Yeah, and when we talk about today, like Shiism versus Sunnism, the contours of those were not quite as stark during this period. So Shiism is really kind of emerging as its own thing. So in fact, the word Shiism comes from the Arabic Shiat Ali, which basically just means party of Ali. So they Shias believe that it was Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, that line should always be the ruler,
Mm.
right? So it's not, Sunnis might have believed that, the community decides on the ruler. The Shia believe that only that line should be the caliph. But we see that those contours become more stark as we go along, and actually the Fatimids are part of what makes that line more stark. So they believed for sure that um, the lineage, the person needs to come from the lineage of the Prophet Muhammad. They also believed that that person had this kind of semi-divine role on earth, so
Mm.
that whoever was the successor, who was the caliph, was also called the imam, where he has this kind of
Mm.
direct link to God. So
Yeah.
it makes them really quite distinct.
The Fatimids were kind of falling from power at that time as well. So was that kind of what allowed them to like challenge Fatimid power, that the Abbasids were falling out, that they
Yeah,
didn't have the power
absolutely.
they once had?
Yeah, so the Abbasids had already kind of been declining in power, and in fact, to make the story more complicated, actually were kind of practically ruled by another Shi'i dynasty called the
Mm.
Buyids. So the Abbasids are still there as caliphs, but for practical purposes, we have this other dynasty. So yeah, so this allows the Umayyads in Spain to come to this new, to declare themselves caliphs, for the Fatimids to declare themselves caliphs, and so that we have this kind of rivalry.
Yeah. So how did they manage to like become this caliphate? Like how did it build up the army? How did it manage to do this? How did it manage to gain power? They weren't very influential family at the time, were they? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, so it's interesting because our early information for the Fatimids is a little bit murky. And part of that is because before they really started having these more imperial ambitions, they operated as kind of a clandestine mission, right? So they followed a particular line of succession. They had particular doctrinal beliefs that were quite distinct from other groups, and they operated really in secrecy until kind of the turn of the 10th century. So they had been operating as this kind of clandestine mission in Syria, in a town called Salamia. Then they moved to North Africa. So they had been more than gathering armies, they had been gathering missionaries. So we have this whole kind of missionary network called the Dawah that's like going out and propagating Ismaili thought. Then when they come to Tunisia, they gain support of various Berbers and kind of other groups. So they're able to amass their armies. They're able to build up even a naval foundation. And so they operate out of Tunisia for about 60 years. Then in Egypt, so in 969, they conquer Egypt. And at that time, Egypt had been ruled pretty ineffectually by kind of vassals of the Abbasids. So Egypt was in pretty rough shape. And so Egypt kind of folded pretty easily.
But didn't they fail the first conquest of Egypt, though?
Yeah, they had tried a couple of times to conquer Egypt and then finally were able to do so. So Egypt had always been on their radar. They always wanted to get Egypt. And it was in 969 that they were able to be successful. And then they became obsessed with conquering Syria. So they conquered Egypt. Pretty quickly thereafter, they so when they conquer Egypt, they have control of all of North Africa and Egypt, and they quickly gain control of the holy cities, so Mecca, Medina, Jerusalem, which is really important because it means they have this Islamic legitimacy.
Yeah, and as you know that you can't be really a caliphate without Mecca and Medina, right?
Exactly. So that was a big coup. But then they spend the next century or so really trying to conquer Syria as well, and they don't have a lot of luck conquering Syria.
So what makes the Syrian campaign go so badly? What is it, Byzantine territory at this time?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they're up against the Byzantines. They just are not getting a foothold. I couldn't tell you too much about the military strategy since I'm an art historian. So I don't know the details of the armies. But they were not able to get a strong foothold. And it was also kind of naval battles and this sort of thing, but they were not able to be, they would kind of gain in Syria, then lose in Syria. And it was this kind of ongoing obsession of theirs.
So why did they establish Cairo as the capital? What did they, because as you know, the Abbasid they founded and created a new capital. Was Cairo founded, was it an entire new city like Baghdad, or was it already a small city at the time?
In some ways, kind of. So Cairo had existed as a center. So basically, Egypt had always been important. So even though it wasn't a capital city, it has always been, an important center of empires. So what we found is that in the previous empires, as they would kind of conquer, they would set up a kind of new city center. So those city centers kind of gradually moved north. And so in a way, when the Fatimids conquered and set up Cairo, it was really just slightly to the north of the old city centers of, we kind of call it Fustat.
Well, was it a strategic location, Cairo, or was it just that we like this place? It looks like a nice place to be.
Well, it's on there was a canal that linked it to the Red Sea, so it was a very kind of important strategic location. It was a source of grain and other kinds of goods.
Was it near the Nile?
Yeah. Oh yeah, Cairo's on the Nile. And the Nile has shifted, but where the Fatimids set up, there would have been a kind of part of the Nile that went right by. And so they set up instantly, basically, as soon as they conquered Cairo, the general Jauhar sets up a palace, right? So he builds a palace and he builds a mosque. So these are the kind of two, most important things for an Islamic ruler to have.
Okay, so what would be the difference between because as you know, majority at the time, I believe, was Sunni, but so not too many people were Shia. And we talked a little bit about this. But what would be the
Yeah.
difference between a Shiite rule versus an Abbasid rule? Did the people like notice a difference there between Shiite Caliphate versus a Sunni Caliphate, which the
Yeah,
Abbasids
so there
were?
are some differences. So for the Fatimids, so as I said, so the imam, so the ruler has this kind of direct link to God, right? So, and of
Yeah.
course the caliph is an important religious figure too, but it's not this kind of like actual, he holds the truths of God.
He wasn't
The
like a 100% autocratic monarch, really.
What's that?
He wasn't an autocratic monarch necessarily.
Yeah, so I mean, for sure, his believers thought that he really was God's representative on earth, right? That he, so for example, the Fatimids also believed that in a distinction between a kind of visible reality, like what we see, and then the hidden meanings of everything. So they call it this distinction between the batin, the hidden, and the zahir, or what we see.
Yeah.
And so to them, only the imam knows these things, right? Now, the Sunni majority, your average Sunni walking around Cairo probably didn't care, but certainly Sunni legal scholars did care about this, right?
Yeah.
This was all this
Mostly
was
then
very
mostly the
problematic.
nobility would notice the difference here, right?
Yeah, and then there were ways that was made very overt. So for example, there's a slight change in how the call to prayer is done for Shia versus Sunnis. There's a difference in how Ramadan begins. So there are some of these practical differences that were in place. And we see that the Fatimids at various times either assert those, right? So that they assert this difference, or at other times they get rid of those differences so that they don't appear different.
Was this kind of controversy in the Islamic world at the time, or that it kind of happened in different places?
It does seem to have been, yeah. So one problem, or one complication that we have from the Fatimid era, is that most of our sources actually post date the Fatimid era. So that we do have Fatimid sources that are preserved in like later encyclopedias or histories, but that we don't have a ton of kind of geographies or chronicles that are right from the Fatimid era. So they certainly play up the difference and see it as very problematic. It does seem that the other caliphates, brought up this difference and try to kind of make it a political issue. Whether your average person on the streets of Cairo cared, that's something that we don't know.
Yeah. So okay, so there is two different sects that appears at the time under the Fatimid Caliphate, which was the Seveners and the Twelvers. Who were they? And is it
So
weird? It does it kind of sound like a football team a little bit, the Seveners
the
and the
Seveners
Twelvers.
versus 12ers. Oh, football teams now are into really esoteric categories. Yeah.
But
So the
the
12ers are
seriousness
not.
of
So the 12ers are not really part of the story. So you're talking about. So now we're getting really into Shiism. So within Shiism, there's a lot of splits, and so this is when I say like the strict contours between Shiism and Sunnism were not really developed at that time. That's because there's so many kind of smaller groups, and each, they're all kind of have these slight differences. So we call the Ismailis, so the Fatimids are part of this Ismaili line, Seveners. And the reason we call them this is that they believe that the seventh Imam has actually gone into occultation, meaning he's disappeared from Earth, but is still kind of around.
yeah.
So he's going to kind of reappear as a kind of Messiah figure, a Mahdi. For the Twelvers, which is, so most Shia today are Twelvers, right? So if you think about, the Shi'i community in Iran, they're all Twelvers. They believe
Also,
that
the
actually,
sects are still going on today in the Islamic world.
yeah. So for sure, the Twelvers are, going really strong.
Is
It's,
it right to
say
call it a sect though, kind of, or is it
what's that?
is it right to call it a sect at this point? No, can that
Yeah,
be
I think
fair?
so. I think so. Yeah. So the Twelvers, though, think that there's this other imam who's disappeared. And they anyway, we can go, I don't want to go into too much detail because I'll nerd out over the differences because they're fascinating. So most Shia today are 12ers, but we do have communities of Ismailis as well, or seveners. And in fact, I think probably the most famous kind of group of those are those who believe that the Aga Khan, who, I don't know if you've heard of him, he's an important religious figure, that he is the living imam. So we still have people who, there is a living guy who actually does a lot of great work for art and architecture. They believe that he is the imam of our age.
So what were they doing? How did the 12ers and 7ers try to spread in the Islamic world during the Fatimid times?
Well, so during the Fatimid times, I mean, they kind of, it's interesting because they didn't spread as much as you would think, given that they were an empire. So they spread secretly. So the Fatimids had a very hierarchical structure of religious revelation.
So what was this? Should you go into the hierarchical structure for a little bit?
So what that was called was the dawah, or like the call or the mission. And so it would mean that, so it really is like kind of a pyramid, right? So as you declare I'm Ismaili, you get a little bit of that hidden knowledge that I spoke of. So as I said, this hidden knowledge of reality, or the kind of inner truths of the Ismaili belief system. You would get like a little bit of that. And then as you rise up, you get a little bit more. And as you rise up, you get a little bit more. So things are kind of gradually revealed to the initiated. However, many of the initiated, unless you're really part of the Cairene court, if you're close to the court, you can kind of live openly. Most of the Ismailis kind of lived in secret. So they didn't tell people that they were Ismaili. They didn't spread it. So, which is very fascinating, right? So, and these, the kind of the your best places to learn were in the Cairo Fatimid city. So within the walled palace, this is where like a lot of these hidden truths were revealed. What's interesting though is it doesn't seem like Ismailism as a faith spread all that far and wide. So for example, once the Fatimids left Egypt, we have like hardly any Ismailis. They haven't converted the population.
So let's talk about Cairo for a second, the city. How did that one flourish during the Fatimid era, during the Fatimid Caliphate?
Yeah, so it was very flourishing. So they had a lot of resources from crops. They had, of course, the Nile, and then the Fatimids had a lot of conquests. So we also have, goods from these conquests. So it was a very wealthy, particularly in the first part of the Fatimid dynasty. It was a very wealthy dynasty. We have tales of travelers coming to the Cairene palace and being amazed at the wonders therein. So it was extraordinarily wealthy.
So as we know, if you read a little bit of Islamic history, you know that they were somewhat tolerant, and we discussed this in the episode with Virginia Accent a while ago as well. That then we asked the question, what is tolerance? What can it really be? But were they tolerant in the religious beliefs as the previous empires and caliphates has been? Like, how did they tolerate Sunni? Were they kind of like second-rate citizens in a sense, or how was toleration in the Fatimid Caliphate?
The Fatimids are known for having been very tolerant, and of course, as you said, tolerance is one of these things that kind of waxes and wanes, right? So. So it's not that other caliphates were always intolerant, right? We have great moments of tolerance and cooperation under all of the caliphates, and then moments of friction. And
I think it's fair to say that they were more tolerant than what Europe were at the time, though.
Oh, sure. Yeah, they're all, compared to Europe, far more tolerant. We don't have. It's a much more religiously diverse society. So, for example, Egypt had large populations of not only Sunnis, but Christians and Jews. And they all, lived together and got along. And we have, not always, but often got along. And we know that Christians and Jews rose to high positions within the Fatimid court, many of whom didn't even convert. And then, Sunnis too are, completely tolerated. And I'm sure in like some, religiously they were considered not as great, but I think politically it was no difference.
I think I don't remember where I read it or which caliphate exactly it was, but I think it was the Fatimids where there was a you could see sometimes that a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim would talk together and have scholarly debates, and they would
Yeah,
actually sit together,
absolutely.
no problem.
Yeah, and that's not exclusive to the Fatimid Caliphate, but that we have, many prominent examples of that happening under the Fatimids.
Which
So
I
yeah,
kind of find
it's a
incredible.
very, very different picture of the Middle Ages from what we think about in Europe. So we
Mm,
really do have a kind of practical. People did not need to convert. People generally
mm.
were allowed to practice. I mean, it's not a modern sensibility of tolerance, right? It's
Yeah.
still, religion is still very
You had to pay
important.
a tax, of course. We said it several times
And they're
that you had to
taxed
say,
more, exactly. So there's the jizya. So they do have to pay more in taxes if they're not
mm,
Muslim. So, and in some ways, the caliphs needed those
yeah.
populations
And
because
it wasn't just the Ottomans who's mostly famous for the Janissaries, of course, but the other Islamic caliphates, like the Fatimids, I believe, did take Christian children into slave soldiers as well. It wasn't
yeah,
just an Ottoman invention, right?
no, and of course,
And
yeah,
I mean, that's how
exactly.
you got
So
the
they're
Mamluks in the
conscripted.
first
They're
place.
conscripted, and the reason that this is that you can't bring a Muslim into slavery, right? It's forbidden.
Yeah.
So they would bring these children in, and when, of course, the big caveat is when we talk about slavery in this time, it's very different from what, as an American, we
Yeah.
picture. It's not like chattel slavery, but it's still
It
slavery,
was more
right?
like Roman slavery in a
It was more,
sense.
exactly, yeah. So, and some of them rose to very high ranks, and this sort of thing. In fact, we have a whole dynasty, the Mamluks, who are built
Yeah.
from these slave soldiers.
Yeah. So, of course, when let's talk about like you said, that this is where your study is the art is the Islamic art and architecture. So, what was that like during the Fatimids? We got, of course, the famous Al Achim Mosque. So let's talk about is Fatimid art and architecture. How did that go during the
Yeah,
Fatimids?
so we're really lucky in that we have, from such an early period. I mean, Cairo, for anyone listening, if you like the Middle Ages, go to Cairo, because we have so many monuments that remain in Cairo from,
There is a palace that walls are still up there, right? They got the palace walls in
no,
Fatimid.
well, the walls are still up, yeah, but nothing remains of the Fatimid palace
Mm.
besides the walls. But yeah, so you can see these 11th century walls.
And they are massive.
They are massive, and they're really kind of masterworks of carving. And then you go through the walls and you encounter just dozens of other medieval monuments. I mean, it's
Mm.
really just an embarrassment of
Mm-hmm.
medieval riches. So for the Fatimids, what we see is that in the first part of the dynasty, we have patronage primarily of big Friday mosques and the palace. Like, those are kind of the big centers of patronage. What's interesting is that as the dynasty starts to crumble, so we only have not even 100 years where they are those like really powerful, rich caliphs that are controlling all of these things and are making these huge claims. Things start to get rough for them. They lose territory. There are a series of economic crises, and so the last 100 years of the Fatimids, they're not the kind of the powerful caliphs that we had seen early on. But in that period of relative decline, we get a plethora of these really kind of wonderful smaller structures, many of
Mm.
which are shrines. So we get shrines to kind of saintly figures, shrines to people from the family of the Prophet Muhammad, who of course would be particularly important for the Fatimids. So we get these different kinds of structures. The
Can
Fatimids
people
are
still go
also,
see them if they go to Cairo, for example,
yeah,
today or other parts of Fatimid
yeah, you
ruled
can still see
territory?
them. Now, I will say, what's interesting is many of the Fatimid monuments have been pretty heavily restored, sometimes in ways that are not responsible to the original material.
Mm.
So, what's fascinating, it's actually largely an Ismaili community from South Asia, and who has restored them in a way that's great for their community. But we persnickety
For
historians.
historians, it's kind of a no-no.
Yeah, we're like, everything's gleaming, and so but you can still see them, and many of them are still important sites of piety.
Yeah.
So the Fatimids are also known for having really fantastic portable arts. So they're particularly known for luster ceramics, which have this kind of metallic sheen, a lot of kind of figural arts relative to other dynasties, ivories, wood. They have a lot of artistic production.
So do you forgive me, I'm not too great with remembering names, I'm not gonna lie to you. But let's talk something we haven't talked much about is the caliph themselves. So do you have some memorable caliphs from the area that is worth mentioning that did be considered great caliphs, or not so great caliphs that we should talk about worth mentioning here?
Sure, yeah, tons. There's a lot of caliphs. So as I said, so in this beginning stage, we have three caliphs in Cairo that are really, powerful. So there's Al-Mu'izz, Al-Aziz, and Al-Hakim. So Al-Mu'izz, founds Cairo.
Wasn't
Al-Aziz,
Hakim who kind of walked out of the desert and just disappeared? Was that
yeah,
him?
so he is the most fascinating character. So we have Al-Mu'izz, Al-Aziz. They're building the empire. They're, considered good rulers. They're very tolerant of the populations. They're really considered these kind of this kind of golden age of Fatimid rule. Then Al-Hakim comes along. So many people think that he was insane, because he has all of these edicts and he does them and he reverses them. And he is a singular historical figure. He's a very odd guy. And so some of the things that he does is he has a lot of persecution against Christians and Jews in his realm. He actually
Because it wouldn't be, I mean, to be fair, it wouldn't be a medieval empire without persecution.
But I mean, Islamic medieval empires often don't have that. We really have many kind of tolerant empires. But of course, then we do have these kinds of flare-ups of intolerance, right? It's not kind of, this is the problem, I suppose, of having this kind of ruler, is that they can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
So if you get one that has this anyway, so he's very singular. So huge persecution against Christians and Jews. He most famously calls for the destruction of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which is, a huge breach of a peace treaty that had been going on with Byzantium. What's most fascinating is really the last few years of his life. So if you remember, I talked about, the difference between this kind of hidden reality and this visible reality.
Yeah.
So there's a group of people who really take that to the extreme, right? And so they really see Al-Hakim as not just being kind of God's representative, but God himself, right? They think Al-Hakim, he's God. All of
Doesn't that kind of contradict Muhammad though?
Oh yeah. Yeah. It's but to them, Al-Hakim brought in this kind of new era of teachings, right? He's wiped out kind of the old history. He is God himself. Those followers actually are now escaped Cairo, and they're now known as the Druze. If you've heard of the Druze, Druze,
I don't remember so.
it's a religious minority that are mostly in the mountains of Syria and Lebanon. So they are from this period. It's fascinating. So
it's
anyway,
it's not a later assassins, is it?
Yeah, so the assassins come out of this too, so are not from this same moment, but basically these later years of the Fatimids, we get all these kinds of succession crises and all this splintering, and what we now know of the assassins kind of comes from one of those splinterings. But so Al-Hakim though, so these last years of his life, there's basically a huge crisis in Cairo because we have these people proclaiming that he's God. Lots of his kind of the Dawa, these Ismaili missionaries are, trying to dial that back and saying like, no, this is not right. We don't know exactly what Al-Hakim's role was in all of this. If he encouraged it, if he did, sources say different things.
He must have liked it somehow though. Who doesn't like being told, oh, I'm a god?
I think he probably did. But he's found, so he goes for a walk in the mountains and he's never found, but his cloak is found with multiple stab wounds. Yeah. Oh, are you frozen?
Oh yeah, no, you froze a little bit. You're back now. Yeah.
Okay.
So yeah, just what does it? What do you think? Did he go insane? Just like I'm gonna
So
take a walk and never come back.
well, so he was known for taking these long walks. So
Mm,
even prior to him going missing, he would go and like take these long walks. So that part was not unique. Some people, some of his followers thought he had himself gone into occultation, like he had
mm,
disappeared from the earth.
mm,
I think most historians think it was likely an assassination by someone within the Fatimid
mm.
court. In particular, people think his sister,
It was just a cover-up story kind of thing.
that she might have called for his killing, because the other crazy thing that he does late in his reign is that, as I mentioned, so for the Ismailis, lineage is so important, right? So you have to kind of, your lineage and your descendants is so important. Al-Hakim kind of messed this all up by not naming his son a successor, but by naming a cousin successor, and splitting the caliph and the imam. This is all just, it's
They were
crazy,
not fond of it, to put it
right?
that
This is
way.
just crazy. So it's thought that it was, that his sister might have called for it in order to, get a proper succession going.
Yeah. Okay, so what? So how does it? What happens after his disappearance? What's going on next then?
So it's interesting. So after he disappears, we have another ruler who comes to the throne at a very young age, and he rules, oh gosh, maybe for 10, 15 years. I'm trying to
That's not
remember.
too bad though.
Yeah, it's wait, hold on. I'm actually looking this up. Uh I'm reigning. So how long did Azahir reign? Now I have to look this up because I'm an art historian and I'm terrible with dates.
That's all right. Don't
Yeah, so
worry
he
about it.
reigns for about 15 years, but he's he comes to it young, so he is kind of he has a regent at first, so he's not
Mm.
really in control. And
He
so
must be
in
a
that
decent. He
way,
must be a decent caliph though, if he managed to rule for so. It's kind of long in the Islamic caliphate history, if you think about it, like that he managed to
but
rule for
what's
this long.
interesting though is that we don't, I mean, I think because he comes to the throne at a young age, we don't know, there's not a lot of record of him actually,
Mm.
and part of that also has to do with like when geographies end and stuff. So we have a lot more information about is Aziz al-Hakim than we do about al-Zahir.
Yeah.
For me, and so what he does is he kind of, it's a period of kind of rebuilding. So he resecures peace treaties with
Mm.
Byzantines. He allows them to rebuild the church, although it takes a while for them to actually do this. And in my book, I discussed that he also calls, at the same time that, like, he's allowing for the Holy Sepulchre to be rebuilt, he also reimagines or patronizes the refurbishment of Islamic monuments within Jerusalem. So he's kind of shoring up stuff in Jerusalem at the same time.
But since it's mentioned that it came on so young, what was it more like a puppet in a sense to
At the
others?
beginning, for sure, yeah. And Al Hakim was too. I mean, many of these rulers come to the
Mm.
throne very, very
I mean,
young.
some even dramas are 6, 7, right?
Exactly. So exactly. So hold on one second. Yeah. So they often come quite young and
Mm.
act. So Sitt al Mulk, in his early years, we think really had a lot of power,
Mm.
as his aunt. So and we have another kind of succession issue that he kind of that reign tamps down. So, and then after that, so then we have that period, and then we have a the next ruler reigns for a really long time, like over 20 years, Al
Ooh.
Mustansir. However, under his reign, we really have the dynasty crumbling a bit. I mean, they're really losing ground. There's a more internal crises, and the years where the Nile doesn't flood properly. So we really see the empire kind of disintegrating, and he actually brings in an outside person, so a
Mm.
general, Badr al-Jamali, who he brings in, who's kind of has an Armenian background, is brought into Cairo, and then we start to see kind of a division of political responsibility that's carried out by these like viziers, and then the kind of the caliph still being called the caliph, still having this role of the imam for the faithful, but the kind of practical political matters and are often carried out by these viziers, who are often these kind of military generals or governors.
Something we haven't talked much about, and I've been wanting to talk about this, because as you said, Abbasid has declined in power. They were basically puppets at this point when the Fatimids came. But what was the tension like between these two rival caliphates? What was it? Did they kind of accept each other or did they just like were rivals still?
Oh, they're rivals. They're definitely rivals. The yeah, I mean they don't like each other. So one of the things that could really rankle the other caliphate is to have someone read the other caliph's name in the khutbah, or the sermon, the Friday sermon. So we have, instances of the Abbasids trying to get people in Fatimid territory to give a sermon in the name of the Abbasid Caliph. We have Fatimids doing the same.
Like an insult kind of?
No, it's just so if you picture like a sermon, and you go through it, they're not even insulting. They're simply giving the name of the caliph, so they're kind of recognizing the ruler.
Oh, right, yeah. Right? I was thinking about Qatar's fighting.
Yeah, so they recognize the other ruler.
Oh, right, yeah. Were they waging war on each other? Like, I mean, I know that in Islamic rule, you can't really wage war on another Islamic. But it's nice, or other Muslims, but like where they still happen, of course. But where they trying to wage war against each other?
For sure. So they basically have almost like proxies a lot of times. So as you said, like the Abbasids had kind of lost territory, and so but they have all these kind of vassals of the Abbasid state. So they have kind of wars and skirmishes with these vassals. So for example, like they lose Mecca, the Seljuks come in later in the reign too, and they're a huge force that operate nominally as vassals to the Abbasids, but the Abbasids are really just figureheads for the Seljuks.
Something that fascinates me about the Abbasid though is that they're still, well, technically just not technically not, but they're still kind of around when the Mongol invasion in the 1200s.
Oh yeah, they're around.
That's kind of that is just that's what they've survived the Fatimid Caliphates in a sense.
Oh yeah, yeah. The Abbasids are around for a long time, and still, I mean, even the Ottomans are thought to bring the last caliph to Istanbul, and they remain really important ideological figures, even if they're not politically powerful.
I'd rather admit though that this is an episode about the Fatimids. I must say that I really admire Abbasid history and the Abbasid Caliphate simply because
you should. I mean, the Abbasids are amazing.
There's focus on science as well. That's what fascinates me. That they were so ahead of their times at the time when they were around.
They really were. I mean, particularly kind of prior to the Fatimids. I mean, we you have basically, these huge centers of learning. You have scholars from all over the world come into Baghdad. We even have the preservation of Greek and Roman texts that were actually lost to kind of Europe, but preserved in Baghdad, so that later on, when scholars are translating Greek and Roman texts, they're actually translating them from Arabic, because that was the kind of conduit. So it's extremely advanced, extremely kind of multicultural. Now, as an art historian, the reason I say I don't like them as much as the Fatimids is simply because most of the material remains of Baghdad, we just don't have a lot. So we have some archaeological sites, but we have fewer things to look at than we do for the Fatimids.
And that's what's fascinating me. Another thing about the Islamic world and Islamic history is that they were so welcoming of science, whereas Christianity in medieval world were like you were frowned upon, and you were looked down upon if you were said you were a scientist. And
Yeah,
whereas
yeah.
in the Islamic world, you were, welcome. Like
Yeah.
it.
And it was part of how you knew God too,
Mm,
right? So that this was learning about the natural world was not seen as being in opposition to your faith, but
mm.
a way to practice your faith.
Yeah, imagine where it would be if Christianity were like that. Huh?
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so yeah, moving on back to the Fatimids. I'm sorry for getting a little distracted right there, but they do start to decline at some point, and of course it wouldn't be Islamic empire without its fitna. So how does the fitna or civil war in the English language happen? What how does that
So that does
how did
happen.
it
I
start
mean,
to decline?
I will say, I mean, we don't always have that as collapsing things in the Islamic world, but in the case of the Fatimids, it's not really a civil war. It's more just that things are kind of crumbling. We
Mm,
have they're losing ground. They don't have as much power. There are various economic crises, and then there are several succession crises where the Ismailis go off in different groups. I mean, the reason I say they're not necessarily fitnas is that this is still such a minority population that people are not. I don't know that your average Egyptian cares that much about who's if this is this line or this line, right?
yeah.
So yeah, but they lose a lot of
I mean, we were talking
ground,
about
and then
this.
eventually they're kind of taken over by their own viziers, who
Yeah.
then are Sunni in um confession and are now busy fighting the Crusades and the Seljuks and uh
Mm,
all of this. So, for example, I'm sorry, back to your earlier point about competing with Islamic rule, you had mentioned the walls of Cairo before.
yeah.
So, the walls we have now were actually built to keep out the Seljuk Turks. So,
Mm,
we have this kind of new Islamic power coming to the fore,
yeah.
who claim allegiance to the Abbasids, but are also encroaching on the Fatimids.
Yeah, and I was going to say something. Yeah, but I kind of forgot what I was trying to say for now. But what they do is start to decline. There is also a revival where you think they're gonna fall. They don't really fall. They manage to build themselves back up again. So how did they do that? How did they build themselves up again?
The Fatimids or the
Yeah,
Abbasids?
the Fatimids. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you thinking of something in particular?
No, I mean not you. I remember when I read in Michael Brett's book a while ago that they were in decline, but then they steadily started to build themselves up again.
Yeah,
In
I mean, I think, I mean, he probably goes into more depth than I know about this, but that economic circumstances change, right?
mm,
Stable rulership is good. And I mean,
yeah,
just like anything, right? You go into decline, and then I don't think we ever had it as big, as strong as it was, prior to
mm.
Mustansir.
I mean that's usually the case though, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So that you do have these times. So as I mentioned, in a very simplistic way, we have this kind of later period as being controlled by viziers, but there are moments that the caliph kind of is much more powerful,
Mm,
and operates at a much higher level.
yeah.
But that these are kind of it doesn't get the momentum as in the
Mm.
earlier.
You mentioned earlier a few minutes ago, and I said this in our episode about the Justinian said the second as well, that average person necessarily didn't care about what you said about that they didn't care who were ruled, really, like the peasants, if you will. And there's a great I said this in that episode as well, but I want to repeat it here that there's a great joke in Cheers where Rebecca comes back and in the later seasons and he asked Sam asked your people, dude, are you okay with a new manager? And the Norm asked kind of, will the price of beer change? No, then we don't really care. So it was kind of
Yeah,
that kind of
exactly.
game.
Exactly. Price of bread, like these are the things that your average person probably cares most about.
It wasn't like, oh now everything's gonna fuck up.
Yeah.
It wasn't like having Trump versus Obama kind of thing.
Yeah, but so there people get, all riled up, right? So, but I mean, which is not to say that there weren't normal people who cared about these things. We do have historical record that people are caring, but you can't imagine that it's quite, I mean, it's not a democracy, right? So you're
Yeah.
always being ruled by some outsider.
Mm.
So in the case of Egypt anyway, so it's a very different kind of dynamic
Mm.
for the people who live there. Now, the other really fascinating thing, one of the things I really love about working on the Fatimids is that, so in the Middle Ages, it's really hard to know what normal people, what your average.
Yeah, that's kind of sad, I think, because it would be fascinating to know what the average people thought and how they felt about this.
Well, where we can get that though, I think the most exciting kind of branch of Fatimid or Egyptian history, medieval Egyptian history, are the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza. Do you know about this?
Not familiar to me now.
So in the 19th century, people found a huge trove of documents from the Jewish community in Cairo. So there's a practice within Judaism that if something has like the word of God in it, you have to dispose of it in a proper way. So there was a cache of these manuscripts that are just pieces of paper that were
Yeah.
kind of put aside to be, buried properly, and then they never were. So what we basically have is 1,000-year-old recycling bin of the Jewish community in Cairo. And there's a vibrant field of Geniza studies that are, going through these documents. And what you get in there is you just hear like the voices of a 10th century person, right? So
Yeah.
you just suddenly hear someone, complaining about their husband being gone too long on some, trip, or talking about, the cheese they like, or, all these kind of
Yeah.
glimpses of everyday concerns. In addition to, of course, there are religious texts, and there are even, parts of Fatimid documents that have been reused. I mean, but it's fascinating because you just get these kind of breathtaking, if you're, one day just Google Geniza. And so Princeton and Cambridge have these big Geniza study labs, and they'll give you like a slip note of the day or whatever, and you can just, and sometimes it really is just absolutely breathtaking to just see kind of humanity from 1,000 years ago.
And I don't know how many listeners listen averagely to this podcast, but I said this before as well, that, history is very much about the elite. We never get to know much about the peasantry. Don't do it.
Yeah, no, not
Which,
too much.
mm. And
So
of
which is
course,
why the Geniza is such a like
yeah.
fabulous treasure.
Mm. And of course, we have to discuss the decline again a second time, a bit, but this time by the hands. Of course, he's unavoidable when it comes to Fatimid history. Saladin, or Salah
Yeah,
al-Din. So
yeah.
how does he come in? Because
So he's
he
actually,
seemed to be kind of on the side of the caliph at first, but then kind of, I might get his power for myself kind of
yeah,
thing.
basically. So it's again, he's kind of operating almost like a vizier for the Fatimids, and then, claims power for himself. He's fighting again against the Crusaders and the
Mm.
Seljuks, right? So I mean, he's
And this
doing
is
some
a
very,
third crusade, right?
oh God, you would ask me which crusade it was.
I think it's a third
First
crusade. I'm
crusade.
pretty
That
sure.
sounds right. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
not the fourth and it's not the first. So
Mm.
second or third.
Yeah.
Um, so
It's the one where
he
Richard Nineheart is in. That's it.
okay, that's right. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's right. So he's fighting on these fronts. He takes over, and what's interesting there is then we have, again, as an architectural historian, scholars often see this period as kind of, they often refer to this as the Sunni revival, where the Ayyubids are kind of interested in religious legitimacy, not only against the Crusaders, but kind of wiping out the legacy of the Fatimids, right?
Mm.
Of this kind of this Shi'i period. So I mean, it's fascinating that as I said, that Ismailis don't really remain in Cairo. We don't
Yeah.
have a sizable Shi'i community. in Egypt anymore.
So we did kind of succeed in that sense, though.
Yeah, and what we don't totally know is like we don't know how robust that community was under the Fatimids. We don't know if it's something that was done away with or if it just never caught steam for whatever reason that they weren't interested in that. So, but we see different kinds of architectural projects. So under the Sunnis, for example, we see a lot of construction monuments that include schools for like the 4 schools of Sunni Islamic thought. So we see kind of a codification of Sunni thought architecturally under the Ayyubids.
So what made him change his mind now? Does he see that the Fatimids is really they're kind of losing their grip at this point? Does he realize that this might be my chance? What makes him think
I
that
suspect, I mean,
do we know why he
changed
changed his mind?
This is, beyond what I've done. So I don't know what makes Salahuddin, choose that moment. I suspect it is just
It was just the right time at the
right time, right place, exactly. But honestly, I'm sure that this is written about, and I'm it's beyond my expertise.
And I think that pretty much Saladin is, of course, a whole episode of its own, and I definitely intend to do him.
Oh, great.
At some point, I will do more Islamic episodes as well. So please stick around if you like Islamic history. I just haven't gotten around doing it as much as I would like to because it's super fascinating, this era of history. But thank you so much for coming on. It was a pleasure to have you. And where can people buy your books? And do you have anything you wish me to put in the description below? If any links, anything, social media, if you want to promote?
Sure. Definitely my book is Building the Caliphate, Construction, Destruction, and Sectarian Identity in Fatimid Architecture. So check that out. It's from Yale University Press, and I teach at the University of Wisconsin.
Thank you so much for coming on. This has been Well.H12. We are available on social media, on Instagram, under Well.H12. You can find us there. If you want to see my photos from my time when I was in Berlin and I visited the Islamic Museum there, you can go find those as you stroll a little bit down. You can also see when I met Professor Irving Finkel, a previous historian on this podcast. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, YouTube, wherever you can find this podcast. If you are an Apple Podcast, and I know there is quite a few listeners there, please consider writing a review. And if you have a request for topic or historian that you would like to see on the podcast, that is your favorite, that you would like to hear, please consider writing me and I will get in touch on my email, which is also in the description, and I will consider having him on. I am always open to suggestions. So please like, share, and subscribe. And I'll see you next time.